Hello everyone, welcome. My name is Adam Belcour. I'm associate producer and director of casting here at Goodman Theatre. Welcome to the Artist Encounter for Buzzer. We're thrilled that you're here. These events, as well as the production, wouldn't be possible without quite a bit of support, and I wanted to make note and a little applause for our production. The Owen season sponsor is the Bank of America. Our sponsor partner is the Goodman Scene Makers Board. Our contributing sponsor is Heydrich and Struggles, and additional support was provided by the season and production sponsors and the Cultural Diversity Endowment Fund donors. And the official airline of American Airlines? The official airline of the Goodman Theatre is American Airlines. Wonderful. So you have programs in front of you, so rather than do long introductions, I will turn the discussion over to our moderator. But first, let me introduce our director, Jessica Thebus, our playwright, Tracey Scott Wilson, and our moderator for the discussion, Professor Michelle Wright.
Well, hello and welcome. Thank you all for coming out this afternoon for a discussion on Buzzer by Tracey Scott Wilson, directed by Jessica Thebus. How many of you have seen the play, actually? I wanted to ask. Okay, so a fair amount. I was warned not to give away spoilers, so I don't have people bum rushing the stage and trying to attack me and stop me giving away all the goodies. So we'll be careful of that. But both for those of you who have seen the play and those of you who haven't, it's of course just such a striking play because it talks about socioeconomic upheaval happening as we speak, taking place, I'm assuming actually in Chicago. But
actually, no, New York.
Shows what is Chicago and I've already become. It's like, well, of course it takes place in Chicago. So in New York. But did you find it transferable, the sort of issue of gentrification?
I think that's a great question. And actually, that leads me directly to the set design. Because, for me coming in, I feel like in some ways, of course, this story could take place in any city in America, and that's important. But it's also very specific to where it is.
What did you find to be perhaps the differences of it taking place in New York, but nonetheless showing it in Chicago at the Goodman?
I think gentrification in New York is very unique, especially and very different from Chicago. In New York, it manifests itself. There are poor communities that live right next to the very rich enclaves, and here, from what I understand, poor communities just get completely moved out. So that's a very sort of different experience because in New York City, you have to sort of willfully ignore it, but you can't escape it. So it's a little different in that sense.
Well, I love that you bring that out because that completely comes off in the play. And one thing I really wanted to get into was typically when we talk about socioeconomic oppression and it's dealing with race, I'm used to seeing plays that just draw a very heavy binary and say all the black people will be the oppressed group and the white people will be the oppressors. And often I come away thinking about the folks I mix with on a daily basis who come from all walks of life and all racial backgrounds and diversities. And so I always wonder, well, how then are we going to read a wealthy black person in relationship to a poor white person? And what you do in this play in exploring gentrification is you really mix it up because you have three characters. You have a privileged white male who's fallen out of favor with his father, Don, because he's had a problem with addiction. You have a young black man who comes from the quote-unquote hood that is now being gentrified, moving in with his white girlfriend. And it's pretty clear that Jackson, the African-American man, does come from a poor background, but is very proud of having made it. He's done all the sort of, marks. He's gone to Exeter, and then he's gone to Harvard, and now he works at a law firm now. I actually am less clear about Susie's background, but maybe we can attach that as the second question. The first was, what made you decide on having those three characters explore gentrification?
Similar to what you said, I just wanted to try to look at it in a complex way and try to see what having these three people from very different backgrounds, what that mix would do when you move into this neighborhood. Because having lived in gentrified neighborhoods, living in that experience changes you. It changes your relationships with the people you are living with, you know. And so, you know, I just wanted to sort of examine it from a you know, different perspectives and just see how that mix would work, and examine it, you know, try to get at the issues of gentrification through these relationships as opposed to as an issue.
Well, Jessica, I wanted to sort of push you on this as the director and ask what sort of things had to go through your mind as you're directing these three characters of different racial and gender and economic backgrounds?
Well, I mean, approaching that was one of the really fascinating things about approaching the play. And there are many ways to talk about it, but I guess I would start with, you know, the actors have to, of course, create believable characters for themselves with backgrounds that are very specific. And so, and I think it's important that in this play, all three characters, once the tensions get going between them, once they start disagreeing about the right way to handle a situation, they start disagreeing about what will keep you safe on the streets outside their home, that they all think they're right. You know, that they all really are very clear. You know, it's not like one of them's crazy and the other one, there's a villain or there's a protagonist. And it's like they all three, from their backgrounds, think that they are very justified and correct in the way that they're behaving. And that continues all the way through to the very end. And so, you know, and I think for us in the audience, it's really challenging and exciting because we, you know, depending on who we are, we have assumptions. And then I even found the first time I read it, I was kind of jumping back and forth between people. Of like, oh yeah, I think he, you know, Don does know a lot more about the streets than Jackson does, obviously. So he's the one, well, okay, wait a minute. But now, now that can't, then he must know, you know, like who's got the information based on where they come from that could solve this problem. And that's what the actors are doing, is really making something that they can commit to, you know, what their whole background is, what everything they bring to this relationship is, and how they can really stand behind their character's point of view. And that's my job, to help them do that. So it's a fascinating work to create that with them.
You know, in academe, we call it, we have a very crude term for what you're referring to. We call it the oppression Olympics, in which you go into a room and people fight over who has the most authority, who can truly speak to oppression and who truly understands it. And Tracey, I wanted to sort of ask you about that, because to a certain degree, we were talking backstage and I was sort of pushing stuff on you. You know, I'm a little bit of a hyperbole there, but nonetheless was talking very excitedly about how I loved how you brought in these tensions. But I wanted to ask you how you decided to come up with a play in which people are really sort of debating about who knows blackness best, because so much of the controversy is about these three black, or I think there may be 5 black men on the corner, and what they really feel and what they really think, and everyone's sort of fighting over who's the authority on them.
I think that came from just growing up. You know, I grew up in Newark, New Jersey, in a rough inner city community. At a time, you know, there was a lot of heroin use and things like that. But I grew up in a very middle class home in the midst of this inner city community. And I was also always constantly, and I went to a Catholic high school, and I was always constantly struggling with, you know, am I black enough? Who is black enough? You know, never being able to dance quite right, never being able to be quite hip enough, and then, you know, going out to college and just constantly struggling with this idea of identity, and, you know, meeting other people, you know, from other classes, from other races who were, for lack of a better word, hipper than I was. And so this whole idea of what is, I've always struggled with this idea of what does it mean to be black at any given moment. And, you know, quite frankly, it just depends on what type of people you're around, how they define blackness at any given moment. So it's constantly changing. And there's just no set identity for that. So it's just something I'm always sort of fascinated with. You know, this idea of who are you, and who the culture says you should be at any given moment.
You're making me think about how in the play there are so many moments in which you are led to think that a certain type of knowledge is about to be revealed, but then it's never given to you. And one thing and I don't think that'll be a spoiler, because let's hope it wasn't a spoiler.
No, it's fine.
The first thing I'm thinking about is the main obsession of the play, these guys in the corner are never actually shown, and they're only talked about through these other characters. So I wanted to ask both of you, what's being conveyed in those moments, and what was behind that choice of not ever having the obsession present?
Well, I could just say, because I think it's stronger to have the idea of this menace in your head than it is to actually have the menace on stage. Because as soon as you embody it, you have to bring certain types of characteristics to it. You have to bring a language to it. And we have all sort of seen this, quote unquote thug or this person, and we all bring our own baggage to it. So, I want the audience to bring their definitions of blackness or definitions of danger to the play, as opposed to me saying, this is what danger looks like, this is what fear looks like. Because what looks like fear to me doesn't look like fear to someone else. And so I just want the audience to bring their own perceptions and their ideas to that. And
yeah, that works very well theatrically too. For those of you who've seen the play, but our set has, the invisible fourth wall, of course, as in many theatrical productions, but in our case, they're windows, they're imaginary windows, that the characters can look out and see the corner. So we see them often. The characters keep returning to these front windows and looking out and seeing the guys on the corner, and they all have different responses at different points in the play. And so we see those guys on the corner being seen. It's almost like the negative space, like we see the reactions to them on the faces of the other characters as the story unfolds. And who the guys on the corner are kind of change for some of the characters during the course of the play as well. So it really is the tensions between the three of them. One of the first things that struck me about this play that I'd like to say about it is its intimacy. The play is very intimate. The characters are intimate with each other. The play is really about the intimacy between them. And then the actors have to have very intimate performances, as we watch it. And we really see how the pressure put on them by the guys on the corner, by the neighborhood, activates, confuses, and tangles that intimacy in a way that feels very real to me. These are three people who know each other well. It's not like they're just coming in, just meeting each other and, whatever, imposing assumptions about each other. They know for years and years, way longer than we've known them. They know each other. And yet, this situation causes unexpected frictions and confusions. And I think, I want to say that Don and Susie, to a certain extent, they both say at different points in the play that they get it. Don had visited the neighborhood when he was young, and Susie has been with Jackson for a long time in a very intimate relationship, and they're both like, I get it. Susie says, I hate it when you condescend to me about race. How long have we been together? I get it. And yet in this situation, it becomes very clear in Act 2 that they don't get it. And they don't even get what Jackson's saying. And he can't believe what they think, and that the slippages are very, they're theatrically and dramatically exciting between them.
I want actually to delve into those slippages, because it even comes up in the title of the play, Buzzer, where you have that very intense symbolism of a broken buzzer where people can buzz the apartment, but you can't communicate with whoever is buzzing down there. So in other words, the inside world can hear this sort of inchoate, buzz that doesn't quite have a specific message, but suggests a certain immediacy. And at the same time, they can't communicate that back. And I wanted to ask the two of you about the choice of calling it Buzzer, and you already talked about the intimacy, the confusion, the slippages. That Buzzer, and then I'm a professor of literature, so I tend to read into everything. If my students are watching this, they can be like, I told you so, Professor. There's not always something behind whatever you're reading there. But I wanted to connect it to two other types of buzzing. You've got the buzzing of Jackson's BlackBerry, and I wanted to ask, I was going through the play, I couldn't find it, but I wanted to ask if you made choices about exactly when that BlackBerry is going to buzz.
I did. When I first moved to New York City, for some reason, the first 2 or 3 apartments I had, I always lived in a constant and I was constantly going downstairs to answer the door. And, you know, I mean, it just sort of, so when I wanted to write a play about gentrification, it just seemed that that was, because it was just a constant sort of frustration, and also, you know, just when the buzzer would ring, anxiety, you know. And just in terms of Jackson's phone, you know, he's a corporate attorney and trying to make partner at a very prestigious law firm in New York City, and lawyers in that position, especially African-American lawyers, but most lawyers, any lawyer trying to make partner, they're married to their BlackBerry. They're married to, you know, receiving messages, getting messages. It's a constant, you know, you just have to sort of constantly be vigilant. So, you know, he's vigilant with his phone, which is a completely different world and he's vigilant in his community in a different way. So he's sort of is divided constantly between this you know world, this aspirational world of great money and privilege, and then this literally day-to-day reality of how do I stay safe in my community, and then the noise of the buzzer. So it's just this constant anxiety of noise. Which I also found happens when you live in a gentrified community. The first thing that you hear is just a lot of noise, constantly, and you know, and you get used to it, but you don't realize how that sort of weighs on you, or stresses you out.
Yeah. Excuse me. I want to follow up about Jackson's. When did you decide to have him suddenly looking at his phone? What?
Well, that's just from dating a corporate attorney. So I just, I just knew what that looked like. I just knew exactly what that was all the time. So it was just, it was in every scene, because that's just how it is. Every single time there's no moment when you are not on that phone.
All right, so I have to tread carefully with this next question so I don't have any spoilers going on. But I love how on one level you've got this buzzing going on, and you can't help but wonder as an audience member, you know, well, who is buzzing at this moment? Who wants to come in? Who is this? And sometimes you find out who it is. Sometimes you don't know. And it reminds me actually of, there are famous novels that do that, like A Passage to India, where you have a supposed rape that took place in these caves, and the novel never actually tells you whether it happened or not. It just simply becomes a he said, she said, and you can't help but wonder. But one thing I love that you do is you have a moment where you actually do get to hear from those that buzz. And the reaction, I think, almost tells us something profound about ourselves. And what I mean by that is you have a moment where a black man comes to the door of the lobby and wants to be let in, and he's knocking on it. Now, what it reminded me of immediately was there was a wonderful episode of a TV sitcom called Roseanne, where she had the same thing happen, where a black man comes to her diner, knocks on the door, and she tells him we're closed. She's clearly nervous. And then before he leaves, he tells her, I'm the father of the student that your child was so rude and racist to the other day. So she has to sort of deal with the fact that her child is learning racism at home. You have that scene end differently, and without giving it away, I wanted to ask you, what made you decide to bring that in? And I have to say, I had an immediate reaction. I love to think of myself as, oh, I'm so liberal, but I had the reaction of like, oh, why is he trying to get in? Why is he trying to get in? And then behind me, there was a couple behind me where they were getting quite upset, and the guy directly behind me was like, why does he want to come in? Which was sort of my unspoken, frustration. What made you decide to bring that scene in?
Okay. Well, as I said, having lived in communities where I've seen gentrification and gentrified as well, I lived in a community. I moved to Crown Heights 2 years ago briefly, and it was a very emotional experience because it was a black Trinidadian Jamaican community, and my girlfriend and I were there, and she's a lawyer, and we were looked at in this building as outsiders in our own community, as people who were going to as gentrifiers, as sort of for lack of bougie. And and then we would go outside, and then white people would treat us as if we were a threat. Literally, one morning, my girlfriend and I, we have a little Datsun, we were walking this Datsun, and there was a white woman who came out across the street, and we wanted to ask her a question about her building, and she literally ran from us. And it was like 7:30 in the morning. We had a Datsun, and
was it an attack dachshund?
Yeah. And you know, it just started me thinking about, you know, she wasn't afraid of me, but something scared her. That she had some experience that told her that these two women walking, you know, that somehow we were, and it just struck me. It just stayed with me because I had no idea what that experience was. So, just in terms of, you know, the guy at the door, it's just that, you know, when situations like that happen, we're in those situations. You know, we could, you know, when that woman did that, initially, of course, I was offended and I was angry, and you know, normally I would, you know, sort of just complain to my friends about all the racism and these gentrifiers living in the community. But since I was considered a gentrifier, it was very complicated. So it just started me thinking about, you know, beyond that, who is that woman, and what caused her to react that way to me. And so that when these situations happen that seem very black and white, they're actually much more complex. And just wanting people to see that, you know, when these things happen, there's a level of complexity that we just don't get to see, and a level of humanity that we don't get to see, that's beyond just the initial slight. So that's what I was trying to explore there.
You know, it's funny because twice now we actually lived in Minneapolis where you developed the show, my girlfriend and I used to joke, but with a certain amount of serious, about how we were a bougie gay couple moving into a minority working class neighborhood. Like, that's where we wanted to live. And we've just done the same thing in Chicago in terms of, well, where can we live? Where can we have a house? And I wanted to ask both of you that larger question about gentrification and ask you, do you see this as, oh, just here we go again, nothing has really changed, or are new elements going on here? Because we have wealthy minorities moving in, we have wealthy queers moving in.
I do not feel like an expert on this issue, you know? I feel like I can only talk from my own experience, which is a little... so it ends up being kind of a self-involved answer. I mean, I think there's no question that it's complicated. Mm-hmm. You know, it's getting increasingly complex. I mean, for exactly the reasons you get. I mean, it's just getting increasingly complex. And the experience that Tracey just spoke about, you know, like who's who and who's where. And I think I tend to hide in the identity of being an artist. Mm-hmm. I also grew up in a bohemian family. You know, I grew up overseas when I was very young and definitely had experiences that were related to race, and we've discussed them, you know, in rehearsal because everybody's personal experience is coming up, but they're very different because they were in other countries and had to do with being American. But I think, you know, my family being very bohemian, and both my parents kind of, this is a non-answer to your question, but anyway, it's my answer. Being, you know, they both were sort of the, you know, the radical, weird element in their families. And so my family's very bohemian and kind of on the edges of things. And I mean, for sure, I had a privileged upbringing, and for sure, I mean, I've had all kinds of advantages. But identity's interesting in my family because even traveling, my family never wanted to be too American or too, I mean, just from my family of origin, there's a real resistance to wanting to belong. And so I think I did not grow up with like, I'm one of these people. I tend to try to not be anything. I can't explain that, except that, I think the currents of that really bring this up. And I think when I've moved into Logan Square and bought a building there, and you know, I've lived in Chicago neighborhoods where I know that I've worked in Chicago neighborhoods where I've been very afraid to park too far away from the rehearsal space there where I was going to. But I don't know, in myself, I always want to find the space where I'm not implicated. And I don't think that's a good thing necessarily, but that does come up when you ask that question, I think.
Well, it's interesting because with both of you, you reflect on your personal experiences, and one thing that comes out is you're expressing identity not as a fixed thing, but something that changes depending on the situation you're in.
Yeah.
And I wanted to tie that into the fact that you're exploring these knowledges and this experience through a play. And I had mentioned to you backstage about how recently a colleague asked me, she wanted to plan a contemporary African American literature course. And she asked me, well, what authors would you recommend? I want really, really current ones. And I was sort of struck because I realized actually the place where I find the most exciting discourses on race going on are in the theater right now. And they're really headlined by African American female playwrights such as yourself. And I wanted to ask you about that. Like, what made you choose to become a playwright? I'm not going to pretend that you were there like, oh, playwright, novelist, poet. Which one should I be? One tends to, know one's medium. But what do you get out of writing plays? And when you're thinking about exploring an idea, how does being a playwright affect that?
No, actually, you're dead on. I came to Playwright because I was a failed novelist. Short story, long story short is I went to Temple University, got a master's in English, and I wrote a novel, and I got 30 rejections in one day for my novel, and it sent me to a spiral, and I had writer's block for the first time in my life, and I took a playwriting class in New York City because I had I wanted to write something, but I didn't want to have any emotional attachment to it. I didn't want to have too many expectations, and I hadn't seen many plays when I was growing up. So I just thought, I'll just do this. And I quickly fell in love with it, and I've never turned back since. I just love the immediacy of it and the collaborative aspect of it. The fact that you write something on the page, you hear it a certain way, then an actor says it another way, and then you hear something different, and it's just constantly changing. Even once you put a production up and you see another production and another interpretation, I just love that it's this constant living thing, and also that it causes you to have more conversations, immediate conversations, you could have with audience members, as opposed to you read a novel, maybe someone else has read that novel, you have a book club or something like that. But there's an immediate, visceral, emotional experience. This I find very satisfying about theater.
It seems really just very much of the time, because as you probably know, when it comes to novels, novelists approach that art form with a very strict sense about time and space. There was a notion that time flows as a linear narrative, and therefore you have a story that builds on itself, and life is like that. It's built and filled with cause and effect. But instead with the theater, you have, I think, what you could simply call, I'm sure you actually have a better term for it than I do, theater time, where things can really sort of change on a dime in the moment, and you can't point to a very nice, neat, linear cause and effect. I'm wondering if you could talk about how that comes in to build the tensions in Buzzer.
That is a great question. I mean, Buzzer really is a very realistic play. Our set is kind of spare, and it has space is sort of folded against space, and especially at the beginning, time is folded against time a bit. But from then on, the scenes are linear. They take place in the apartment. They're, for the most part, and it's not, certainly compared to other plays, other contemporary plays. It's pretty realistic in how it unfolds. But yeah, I think of when you start to work on a play, I feel like it's helpful. The metaphors of a camera. I mean, play and film are different, obviously, but they're, it's you're focusing, like you're slowing down this moment, and then these other moments have to be sort of gone through fairly quickly. And that's not because that's exactly how it would be in life. I think that's we all have our own experience of that. In our memories, when we think back, things unfolded at, we assume, at the regular pace of seconds and minutes and hours. But the moments that are slow and amplified are different from the periods of time we can hardly even remember because they went by so quickly. And I think on the stage, as the collaborative team is trying to mold that, how the time flows so that you get the right moments to land, the right experiences. And it's a great question to have just here because, we haven't opened yet. We opened Tuesday, and we've just been doing our last rehearsals, and our last rehearsals we're really looking at the play and then feeling like, okay, this moment has to come out in more focus, and now you guys have to drive through to this moment which comes out in more focus, and stringing those moments together make the story. Because I think just watching everything given the same value on the stage, the story's unclear.
Well, Tracey, you were talking earlier actually about how in seeing the play being staged and rehearsed in Minneapolis, you came to a certain realization about one character in particular, and that was Susie, and how you found yourself writing that role a little bit differently when you came with a different actress. Could you talk about that a little bit?
Yes, when I initially worked on a play, I worked with the same actors for 2 years, which was a wonderful experience, and they were wonderful actors. But when you sort of develop a play with the same group of people, you sort of end up writing for those voices, just because they're the voices that are in your head every day. And I sort of left behind sort of the character that I had in my head, because I was just sort of focused on the actresses and actors that were in front of me. And so then when we had these auditions here, these actors were just auditioning. I didn't know them, and they were just auditioning for their role, this very specific role. And I was there to audition for parts that were the character, that, you know, emphasized who the character was. So then when the actors came to it, they just came expecting to do that. And then I was able to look through the script and realize, oh, okay, I could you know, amplify that more now, because this is someone who is just trying to do what I initially told them, as opposed to, you know, a more complicated relationship, you know, with an actor in a room.
I wanted to ask one final question before we turn to the audience and ask y'all to come in with questions and comments. And it's a doozy. You found the gentrification question a little bit large and unwieldy, and I'm back with an even bigger question.
Bring it on.
All right. But to tie it into this notion of using the theater as a new medium to explore topics, and how time in the theater has a sort of dynamism, both in terms of how you tell a story, but also how things can change from one rehearsal to the next, from one staging to the next. And the whole issue about gentrification nowadays. I wanted to talk, I wanted to ask you a little bit about how you see the racial landscape changing and staying the same in the United States. And I ask that because we are in the quote-unquote age of Obama, where, at least when I was growing up, the kicker that our white liberal teachers used to always use with us was, well, you know it's still a racist America because we don't have a black president yet. And it's like, well, we have a black president now, but I don't think that racism has mysteriously disappeared. We've seen prominent black folks operate in government and take the world stage, and at the same time, we cannot say, therefore, racial oppression is over. I wanted to ask you how you see that racial landscape playing out.
Wow, that's a heavy question. Okay, well, I'll say this. I remember when Obama first announced his nomination, and I was listening to NPR, and a good friend of mine, Diana McWhorter, who wrote a book called Carry Me Home, about the bombing of the 4 little girls in Birmingham. She's a very perceptive scholar about race in America. And, you know, they had a bunch of people saying what it meant and historically and things like that. And she was very frank and said, listen, Obama will win if he is not considered a threat to white power structure. And she was the only one who said that, and it was just sort of laid there. And so, you know, I'm still a big Obama supporter, but obviously we see now, you know, almost going on 8 years later, that it's much more complicated. You know, he was, you know, when you look at capitalism and, you know, the United States power structure, no one person can fix it, because it's wrapped up in not only race, but just issues of class and what capitalism means and how it works. And so, you know, this whole idea that, you know, we're in this post-racial era somehow, that just because we have an African-American president, that all of a sudden we're supposed to have this harmony. No, because we're still not really talking about class and race, and often the two are confused. And so I think, but what we have done is, I think our conversations about race have become much more limited, because now everyone knows what you're not supposed to say. So we don't say that, but we don't know how to say the things that we need to say. We don't know how to have the very difficult conversations about race and about fear, about class, about privilege, because we're afraid to be offended, we're afraid to be called out. You know, I asked a very good white friend of mine one time why, you know, so white people were so afraid to discuss race, and he said, very frankly, he said, because you could get fired if you say the wrong thing. So I just think we are in a very complicated time in terms of how do we discuss how do we discuss these issues beyond, the strides we had in the civil rights era? How do we go, beyond these very simplistic terms that we've been using to discuss race for the last 40 years?
And it's even, I argue, even more complicated because you have a lot of black folks who are able to speak their views on race, but shocker, they don't all agree.
Yeah,
So
right.
quite often I'll see these confused white liberal faces as they listen to one black person say, well, this is what the black view is, and another black person say, no, this is what black people are all about. Or one of my favorite moments is when we have intergenerational conferences between different scholars, and we will have folks from an older generation saying, I grew up being called colored, and colored is good enough for me, so I don't have a problem with it. And you have the younger generation of black scholars not sure what to say at that moment because they just shouted down a white scholar who said colored people this, colored people that. And you just already have that kind of tension in those individual views. And Jessica, I wanted to ask you, like, how you saw this play contributing to that clarity and confusion.
I think it's essential. I mean, before I met Tracey, and it's been a very exciting, fruitful, collaborative relationship that I really loved going through every minute of it. But before we even met and I read the play, I really felt like, okay, this is an important play. This is an important play because I feel like things are changing so fast, and they're not changing in one easy direction. They're not just like getting better. It's all the fabric's all pulled in different ways. And I mean, what do we expect? It's a slavery, hundreds of years. I'm actually flashing back to an interview that I love with Desmond Tutu about post-apartheid South Africa, and so the interview's asking him about change and about like, okay, so this all happened, but now these experiences of corruption, doesn't that dishearten you? And he has these great quotes about change where he talks about hundreds of years, and then like just the maybe this is where I go when I want to feel hopeful. There's a lot of confusion in change, and things get louder and softer, and it's hard to, the ways that you sort of grew up thinking or know you're supposed to think aren't always applicable. And I think it's only in conversation that it's possible to sort of push through these complex areas that we need to push through. And a play like this gives the audience the opportunity to talk back, the artists working on it, an opportunity to not only talk about the need to have that conversation, but to start to actually have that conversation. Like what you hear about coming out of your mouth in rehearsal, and where is that coming from? Is that coming from my privilege? Is that coming from my assumptions? And the act, I mean, it's just a huge faith in the theater. What does it mean to pretend to be somebody else? Why do we do this silly thing of pretending to be somebody else? Well, to watch the actors playing Susie be like, okay, what do I feel? What do I think in the moment in rehearsal when she actually first, Lee had to shut the door on Luce and not let him in. She was very upset. We'd read it on the page 100 times, but when her body had to actually do that thing to his body, she was very disturbed and couldn't, like, why did she have to do it? And, why would she do it? And he looks like he's very well dressed. Why would she be afraid of him? And, all these things kind of came up. And they're just so, as Tracey says, so eloquently, they're close to the surface as soon as we're in a situation where we're not quite sure what the ground is. And I guess I just don't know why we have an expectation that it should be easy ground to stand on. Why we have it, because I saw Roots when I was growing up, and my mom, and my mom cried, it's like, so then I feel like, great, I know, it's like, I understand how to have that conversation. It's an easy conversation. It's like, it couldn't be a harder conversation, and I think it's weird that we expect it to be just like, done, just like this interviewer talking to Desmond Tutu being like, well, aren't you upset that it's not just, all good now? And I think that's part of, growing up. I think that it's you grow up and things are more complicated than you want them to be, but you grow up and you get braver. And I hope, and I say that also as an educator and a parent. I'm raising a daughter and I teach graduate students, and I have to, without actually knowing myself, like the way to explain this, because so often I don't, I still have to bring up the conversation. I think you have to have some faith in being able to do that in order to do it.
Oh, I absolutely agree, and I think if nothing else, Buzzer is just going to, you know, keep that, forgive the pun, the buzz going in terms of conversations on race in a really immediate and meaningful way. And I wanted to open up the floor to folks who might have questions. Wonderful. Would you be able to come over here, because we are on the web, not on the air, but in cyberspace.
My question is about the sex of the three major characters. Did you ever change that as to, you know, the lawyer being black or being a woman or the boyfriend or the other friend who comes to live with them? Did that go through any variations?
No, that didn't. Once I decided on that, that didn't go into any variations because it, you know, what happens to Susie is sort of a center to the play, and so it changes if she's African American. It changes if Jackson is white. It changes. That dynamic is sort of very specific and fragile, and that.
It's interesting because I was thinking about that too, the harassment, and living in neighborhoods where I would walk by and be harassed. So there's moments where for women of color it conflates with the white female experience, but I was also thinking about those moments where there would be separation, such as when she says, oh, they wouldn't dare bother me. And I'm like, well, I wouldn't say that. Other questions? Oh, yes, please come on up.
Hi.
Hi.
Am I too close to the mic?
No, you're good.
All right, cool. I just noticed with my audience, because I saw the show today, that it was a very reactive audience, because I think the characters are so three-dimensional that you put yourself into these characters and you really feel for them when they're in distress or they're arguing. But what I was really surprised by is during, I think, that final sort of argument, the biggest argument that the three have, there was laughter during it. Even though this is a very serious topic and it's the culmination of their conflict, there was humor during it and there was laughter. And so I was just wondering if you intended that to sort of blend the drama and humor to make it more relatable.
Yeah, I think often in my life, when I've had moments of biggest conflict and sadness, there's always some kind of weird laughter in there. You know, whenever I've lost someone close to me or had close death in the family, there's just always this moment of just laughter, because it's almost you just need a release. Sometimes that's the only. It doesn't completely make the tension go away, but it's almost as if your body just needs a release, and it just sort of looks for that. So I just think that's that's sort of very human, a human reaction, especially for characters who are of that age, you know, as a way of sort of dealing with difficult emotions.
And I have a theory about this too. This may be absolutely wrong, but it interests me in my line of work. The set design, you know, the Owen Theater, fantastic theater, is completely flexible. So you can make different, I suppose not completely, but very flexible. So you can have different stage configurations. And what Walt Spangler, our fantastic set designer, did for us is make this platform that we had originally articulated as wanting to feel like an unstable platform. So it should feel like, you know, if all three characters all walk to one corner, it might tip, you know. And we put the audience so close, you know, I don't know where you were sitting, but you can, when you sit in the first row, you really, you know, and then you can sit behind the stage. But it's not so much like theater in the round. It's like you don't get the same show if you sit behind the stage. You get kind of a secret version of it. So I think that dynamic actually leads to this partially. I think it's encouraged, the audience is really being told by the space that they're part of the story. And that's been intense for the actors to navigate that. But I think in a different space, if you imagine like a proscenium where you're far away and it's beautifully lit and you're out here, I think there would still be laughter because I think the play is very funny. But I think in some of those moments it wouldn't be quite so, you know, like, why are these moments funny? Are they not funny? Are they uncomfortable? And I think the space is really drawing everybody in. So it's the audiences have been very vocal and very reactive, and it does feel like a conversation, even though it, you know, feels it's not always at expected places. And I think that's exciting. It's exciting to be in that room.
Thank you for your answer. Do you mind if I actually ask a second, like a follow-up to that? Were there any reactions when, you know, you first did this play for an audience? Were there any reactions that you didn't expect to within, like a very different reaction than what your reaction was when writing it or when you read the play and directed it?
Yes. Yes, and it's changed night to night. I remember one night I texted Jessica during the show, which you're not supposed to do, because I was just like, it was a moment when they were laughing, and I was like, I can't believe they're laughing. What's wrong? There must be something wrong, And I was in a panic. Jessica was like, calm down, we'll look at it tomorrow, But it's, yeah, and I realized that. And then I talked to some friends who were in the audience that night, and there was just laughter at a moment when I thought there shouldn't be, and she said it was sort of a tense laughter. Like there was a lot of tension at that moment, and they just sort of needed to release in a way. So I had to sort of just allow audiences to have the reaction instead of not being able to control it. So I'm happy with any reaction, any strong reaction to it. At this point, I've sort of let go of that.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. It's very perceptive. And I think there are definitely moments, sometimes there's laughter when Susie is talking about the list of things the guys on the corner have called her. And sometimes there's laughter during the breakup scene. That's, someone's breaking up with someone, I won't tell you. And that's, because the actors it's a very upsetting moment for the characters. It's not funny. Yeah, that was initially very sort of bracing, and we did have a couple days of like, how can we control that? How can we make sure laughter happens here but not here? But then after sitting in the house, I think both of us, as Tracy's saying, started to feel like this audience is totally involved. It's not like they aren't understanding it. So if they're totally involved, I think we just have to kind of let that ride.
I think that's an excellent choice. Yeah, because they were really involved. Like I know I was. Like I was if you look at my playbill, it's completely crushed because there was moments where I was just like twisting it and turning it. It's a credit to your writing because those characters are so relatable and you like really feel for them, and when they have this conflict, you want to see how it's resolved and how their relationships can stay together if they can. Yeah. But thank you for answering my question.
No,
thank you. Oh yes, please come on up.
And I love what you're bringing in with comedy and laughter, because I think you're right. There is it needs to be an intense release in those moments.
Yeah, I find myself thinking about the relationship between Don and Jackson at Exeter. I mean, going to Exeter must have been a terrifying experience for Jackson. And I wouldn't be at all surprised if the jerks at Exeter didn't treat him quite badly. And it also occurred to me that this wasn't the first time that Don had intervened in order to protect Jackson. Not just the guys on the corner, but also from the white jerks at Exeter. Did that go into your thinking at all?
Yeah, there was a speech in there where Susie asked Jackson, why do you love Don so much? And it does go in there, and even beyond sort of protection, Don talks about protecting Jackson physically, and to a certain extent that was true. But even more, the commitment is Don allowed Jackson just to be himself.
Right.
He never judged him. He never made him feel that he should be anything else. And that's always usually the first person you fall in love with is the person you can completely be yourself around, whether it's a male or female or just a friend. And so, when you have that, that's actually such a precious and valuable thing. You never want to let that go. And so that's definitely, especially, Jackson never being able to find his footing in his community or at school. So, Don is a powerful pull for that.
Also, it got me thinking about Obama. He sort of eased into it maybe slower, going to Occidental first and whatnot. But I couldn't just imagine when he first went off to Ivy League. Thank you.
Thanks.
Is Jackson a sort of fulcrum in the play because he's the one that does bring the other two characters together? That's how they meet?
Yeah.
Sort of.
Sort of. I mean, I guess I'm just thinking, when you're blocking the play, like who's standing where. With three people, it's always a triangle, as we know from our three-person friendships that we have. It's always a triangle, no matter where you put all those people. So it tends to shift, and we had some conversation about like, okay, who needs to be in the middle at this point? Who needs to be in the middle at this point? But for me, it's a powerful thing that yes, he brings them together, but also, you kind of expect the woman to be the main point of tension, just because the woman, the two men, and the struggle for the attention or whatever of the woman, that's in the play. But also, Don and Susie have this great competition for who's more important to Jackson. Who's he gonna? So they fight over Jackson, certainly as much as the men kind of fight over her attention, and so I think he's central in that way. I think.
Other questions?
First of all, I think that this play, this concept is a great idea. I haven't seen the play yet, but when you're talking about why this isn't discussed because you're afraid you're going to get fired, is that where all a real social change takes place is in the living room and at home. Okay, not in the president's office, not in Obama. I mean, it does take place there, but at home, it's really all this stuff takes place, and amongst your friends. Also, a question about the play development itself is, what was the change or any big changes you made since the workshopping of the play to its actual mounting and staging?
Well, one of the biggest changes I made here in Chicago was I changed the last scene of the play. I made it shorter, and I think clarified it. The play was initially inspired by a short play that I wrote, and I just came to realize that I was sort of holding on to some parts of that. So the conversation at the end was much longer, and I never thought, that was one aspect of the play I never thought of changing, but the actors just could not wrap their heads around it. They just could not, and at a certain point you had to start to realize that maybe it's not them, that it's the writing. It just coming to realize that. So that was really a great change. One of the biggest changes from Minneapolis to Chicago.
What would you like people to leave the play with?
I just want people to have a conversation and to be able to listen to conversations that make them uncomfortable, to listen to conversations that might make them offended, to think beyond the offense and to try to see beyond the initial maybe miscommunication or just the struggle to try to communicate the words, and just really allow other people to have a conversation about this very difficult thing that we all have trouble talking about, race and class. So I just want that would be my big hope for it.
I love it, and I do have a question fermenting, but I don't want to take time away from folks asking questions. Do we have any other questions at the moment? Well, I'll get mine in as people are thinking. This play is very much of the moment, and as you're pointing out, it brings in issues of class alongside race, so that we are in a different time where we aren't simply looking at, well, all black people are always oppressed and all white people are always the oppressor. If a group of people who were sort of familiar with the racial landscape in the U.S. were going to go see your play, but they were going to go see another play before yours, what would you want that play to be?
Oh my God! Are you seriously asking me that question?
Yes. Good. What would be a good lead up?
Oh man, that's so
you
not
have
fair.
many different directions you could go.
Wow.
What kind of lead up you want?
Yeah. Okay. Do you have one off the top of your head?
I think
No?
that's a question for you.
Okay. I'm just going to say this play because it's the first play that's popped into my head, and it was a huge influence on me when I first started writing plays. And I would say George C. Wolfe's Colored Museum, which is a seminal play about, I think he wrote it in the early 80s, and it deals with various it's a hilarious satire that deals with various stereotypes in the African American community and in theater. He has a hilarious excerpt called the Mama on the Couch play that satirized Raisin in the Sun, those type of plays, and it was just groundbreaking at the time because no one could imagine ever poking holes into that. And it was just such a big influence on me because it was just wow, you could do that. You could do that. You could just say something that's really scary and funny and dark and true and things that you think, but you say amongst your friends, but you don't really discuss. So I would say that play.
I want to argue you can see moments like that in Buzzer where there are times when one of the characters says something like when Dawn talks about how he's not a wigger, you know, and it's like, oh, he went there. I can't believe he said that. And something that Jackson brings in quite a bit. It doesn't have as much of the immediate punch because he brings it in a few times, but that whole notion of the magical Negro. And I was wondering if y'all would be willing to expand on that when Jackson keeps saying, oh, I'm not going to be the magical Negro for you people.
Yeah, it's just something that's my own hang up. I'm always constantly dealing with that in media, you know, movies in particular. You know, and you know, Obama, of course, was constantly, especially early in his term, was constantly being called that for satire and things like that. So, just this idea of this African American character who's somehow more in touch with God and the earth and is brought in just to heal the white characters. I think it's something that is pervasive in our literature and in our movies and TV. So, and Jackson working at a firm and dealing with corporate America and having to just be a certain way, having to seeing himself in that way, in the corporate America, and he's just like, I can't do this at home. And sometimes he says it in satire, but sometimes he just says it out of frustration,
Well, one thing I was thinking about was, especially when you're talking about blackness within an artistic forum, blackness is often what we call overdetermined. In other words, there are so many stereotypes attached to it, it's really hard to start producing in a way that doesn't slip into one stereotype or another. If you have the black person as a basketball player, that's a stereotype. If you have them as a tiny little nerd, that also becomes a stereotype because it's about, look, I don't fit that typical stereotype. I'm Urkel, as opposed to Michael Jordan. And when my partner and I saw the play, one thing that we talked about was it seems as if, it was just to us, that Susie has her moments of explosion, as does Dawn. Jackson also does, but he seems to be more guarded through the play. Like he is always having to perform a certain role in front of other people. He's always aware that there is an audience watching him as a black man.
Yes, I think that that's true to a certain extent to his character, because when you're in that corporate environment, it literally takes over so much of your life, and him being so attached to his black person. So it's almost as if every time he takes out that phone, he puts on Jackson the lawyer, and you cannot have a mistake in an email. You can't make a common mistake in an email. You can't make you just can't make a mistake. So he's constantly going from that to being with his friends, and it just causes you to, I think, just causes a certain amount. You just have to sort of unconsciously, constantly control yourself because God forbid you will explode at work. God forbid you say the wrong thing, because it's just such a slippery slope. So I just think that that's part of his personality. Part of the reason he got into Exeter, part of the reason he got into Harvard, you sort of see it with Obama. I mean, the most ridiculous things happen to him. He's doing State of the Union. Someone says to him, calls him a liar, and he just doesn't flinch. The Republicans do the most ridiculous things, and he just completely, contains his composure, and I just think that it's just sometimes when you're aspire to a certain position of power as an African American, it's something that you have to do.
And I think in the play, Jackson actually does explode physically. I think of 3 times, and he throws the phone, he tears apart the couch looking for the watch, and then the fight. But he collects himself very quickly afterwards. What we get to see as part of his person is that this does come up, this unmanageable, moment, whereas Dawn feels much more comfortable just like exploding all the time, and it's fine. And Jackson actually speaks about that in that, he just feels like it's going to be okay. No matter what he does, it's going to be okay. whereas Jackson is very restrained, and even when it comes out, he pulls himself back together.
You're also making me think of those different sides with both Susie and Don as well, where they suddenly catch themselves or they're on guard, at least when Jackson is present. And then, of course, when he's not there, they have a really eye-opening conversation about how they feel about the neighborhood, and it makes you realize they're also performing when they're around him.
I wouldn't say I wouldn't call it performing so much as what would I call it? I don't want to call it fear. An inability to express themselves and have these conversations about race, because in their minds only certain people have these kind of conversations. Only sort of bad people, the conservatives, the Fox News type of people. So if I have these thoughts, what does that mean for my identity? So I think it's difficult for them because it challenges their identity as young, Obama-supporting, hip white people, and they don't know what to do with these emotions, and they just don't know how to express that. And I think that's part of the issue that we're having in this country sort of right now, is that how do you have these conversations without being one extreme or the other?
I think that's what makes your play so different, is that so many plays on blackness will often have some sort of moral center or explicitly or implicitly instruct the audience, this is how you should feel about blackness all the time. This is how you should interpret it. And what you really give us, to go back to your notion of that shifting stage, is, guess what? There isn't any one answer, and blackness, in fact, is the opposite of something that you can know all the time, that it is much more complicated and multivalent, and Buzzer brings that out.
Yeah, and I would say also, a fascinating thing connecting with that, I completely agree, is the play is also about whiteness and about whether it's visible or invisible, or is it a thing? Excuse me. And in the moment one of the moments you talk about when Susie and Don are alone and have this conversation that they kind of stumble into about how they feel in the neighborhood, and it's been something that we've done very clearly, that they suddenly are sitting closer together, that they have this, as Tracey brought up in rehearsal, they have this unspoken and sort of even unconscious racial solidarity that starts to happen because of the pressure of the neighborhood and because of fear, and that gets them into this moment of intimacy, which is kind of not really, doesn't lead anywhere good and is weird. It's just like, where's that intimacy coming from? And it's because they feel like they have, now, they're so uncomfortable with the conversation that it only lasts a very short time. And then Susie especially feels like, what do I sound like? I can't talk. Okay, I'm just gonna, this is gonna make me a better teacher. And she just moves on from it. But it's that thing that's sparked between them because they're seeing whiteness, which I think, to a lot of us is often an invisible thing, and then they see it, and then they don't know how they're supposed to feel about it, or whether they're supposed to acknowledge it, and then it's a really interesting, it's a central tension in the play, and a really important moment, because the rest of what happens between the characters happens because of that.
Yeah, well, you're just making me think of all those different builds up and explosions in the play. I think we've come to the end of the interview, however, and I just want to thank you so much, Jessica Thebus and Tracey Scott Wilson, for coming and talking about Buzzer at the Goodman.
Thank you.